Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm president of Bay Area Skeptics. I am both pleased and honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Paul Offit. Now, you know him. You've heard him extensively interviewed and quoted by the press and all other media during the COVID pandemic. And even today, he remains a major source for commentary, especially on COVID and vaccination. Last Monday, we had scheduled a meeting at 2 o'clock, I think it was, to set up the talk that you're at tonight. And I got an email from Dr. Offit a day earlier saying, hey, can we move that back to 4 o'clock instead of 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock, I have to talk to Meet the Press. And yes, Bay Area Skeptics is perfectly willing to defer to Meet the Press, in case you're asking about that in the future. You might also have heard him speak last October at SciCon, where he was one of the featured speakers and one of the most popular speakers. He is such a favorite of our skeptic community because he is devoted to and very good at educating the public on the importance of vaccines, including the false connection between vaccines and autism, which is another context in which you may have encountered his work. Dr. Offit is trained as a pediatrician, specializing in infectious diseases. He is the co-inventor of a rotavirus vaccine and currently holds an endowed chair as professor of pediatrics at the School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and is director of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. He has an extensive publication record. He is the recipient of a long list of honors and is the author of 13 books, references to which you will find in the program notes on YouTube. I will note here, though, that his book, Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine, won the Bales Prize in Critical Thinking from the Center for Skeptical Inquiry and was also selected by NPR as one of the best books of 2013. He has served for many years on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee and previously served on the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. In 2020, at the beginning of the COVID emergency, he was asked by Francis Collins to serve on an NIH panel to advise pharmaceutical companies on the construction and testing of COVID vaccines. He'll probably remind you what an extraordinary accomplishment the production of the mRNA-based vaccines was. Warp speed indeed. Needless to say, he has suffered the slings and arrows of outraged vaccine deniers, which did not begin with COVID, but which was only exacerbated by this more recent public controversy. No one should receive the hate mail and death threats that Paul has received for merely telling the public what the scientific consensus is on these subjects. Tonight, he's going to talk to us about unforced errors during the COVID pandemic, much of which forms the core of his newest book, Wake Me When It's Over, just published this month. So enough introduction, although I assure you I could have gone on a whole lot longer with our most accomplished guest. but we want to hear him and not me. So let us hear from Dr. Offit himself. Paul, welcome to Bay Area Skeptics. And this is Tell Me When It's Over.
Thank you very much.
Your brand spanking new book, which, by the way, I just downloaded this afternoon and have started reading.
Good. Okay, so hopefully I'm not breaking up. We were breaking up a little bit earlier. I'll speak slowly. I think what's happened during this pandemic, and we really the 4-year mark just a couple days ago, right? In terms, if you find the start of the pandemic as when the World Health Organization claimed that it was a pandemic, I think that was on March 12th, 2020. So it's been almost exactly 4 years. I think during this time, there's been a loss of trust in public health agencies, a loss of trust in the CDC, a loss of trust in the Food and Drug Administration. And although I think there's just generally been this anti-institutional backlash against not just public health agencies, but the Department of Justice, the FBI, I do think that the public health agencies have suffered. So I'm going to go through why I think that's happened, and make some suggestions as to how maybe we can do better next time. So I'll start from the beginning. There was, at the end of 2019, an animal to human spillover event that occurred in the western section of the Hunan wholesale seafood market. And thus SARS-CoV-2 entered the human population. By January of 2020, so not long after that spillover event occurred, the virus was isolated and sequenced. So now it was possible to make a vaccine. Then over the next 11 months, using a technology, messenger RNA, that has never been used to make a vaccine before, to prevent a virus that had unusual clinical and biological characteristics, we performed 2 large clinical trials. The trial of Pfizer was a 40,000 person trial. The trial of Moderna was a 30,000 person trial. That's about the size of most typical adult and pediatric vaccine trials. And on the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, we reviewed those data in December of 2020. Then over the next 7 months, roughly, without an infrastructure in place to vaccinate or to mass vaccinate adults in the United States, we mass produced, not easy, it's not easy to mass produce a lipid nanoparticle vaccine, but we mass produced, mass distributed, and mass administered this vaccine by July of 2021, so now roughly 7 months into the availability of the vaccine. We had vaccinated about 70% of the United States population. I think that phenomenon, a year and a half of isolating the virus, making a vaccine to prevent it, and distributing it to 70% of the US population was the single greatest medical or scientific phenomenon in my lifetime. And as you can see, since this is a visual, I'm old. My lifetime includes the development of a polio vaccine. And I think this was really remarkable. But we hit a wall. By July of 2021, we hit a wall, and a population simply refused to be vaccinated. And although the vaccine is estimated to have saved about 3 million lives, there were about 300,000 people who lost their lives because they refused to get vaccinated. So why that wall? I mean, why was there this loss of trust? So I want to go back to the beginning and try and explain why I think that happened. So in April of 2020, right? So you're now just a couple months into having isolated the virus. Dr. Francis Collins asked me and about 3 dozen other people who were in my world, meaning sort of virology, immunology types, to do this private-public partnership with industry. It was called the Active Group. That's the acronym ACTIV, meaning Accelerating COVID Technological Innovations and Vaccines. To try and advise the companies about sort of how to test the antivirals and how to test vaccines. And with that same month that we did that, and you know, you're feeling good right here. We're having, you know, these these people who would call themselves experts who are advising these companies on how to move forward on this. So there were lively discussions, spirited discussions, and that same month, April 2020. the FDA authorized the use of hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID. Hydroxychloroquine is an anti-malarial drug. There were no data to suggest that that worked, but the Trump administration wanted a magic medicine to get us out of this pandemic. And there was a physician named Stella Emanuel, who was sort of was with a group called America's Frontline Doctors, or this right-wing group that that was putting forward these largely false notions about COVID. And she was of the belief that this treated COVID. She said she treated 350 patients. We can throw away our masks. COVID's over because hydroxychloroquine works. And Donald Trump was impressed by this. As he said, I saw this remarkable woman, this quote, extraordinary woman. I don't know where she's from, but she was extraordinary, and she's found something that works. So the government purchased 29 million doses of hydroxychloroquine without having any evidence that it worked. So over the next roughly 2.5 months, there were 3 large studies, prospective, placebo-controlled studies done the right way to see whether it worked. And it didn't. It didn't work at all. And because hydroxychloroquine has the side effect of cardiac arrhythmias, which are rare but real, it was, I think, a major failure by the FDA to do what its job is, which is to stand between pharmaceutical companies and the public to make sure that we, the public, are protected against products that don't work or are unsafe. So in that 2.5 months later, they withdrew that recommendation. And that scared people, because what that showed was that the government could twist the arm of the FDA to do what they wanted to do politically. And as a consequence, what happened was 10 states formed their own vaccine committees. They were worried that what happened with hydroxychloroquine would also happen with vaccines. And that because the election was coming up in November of 2020, that the Trump administration would also force the vaccines to be released before they had been shown to be effective or before they had been shown to be safe. And there was reason to worry, because Donald Trump called Stephen Hahn, the commissioner, into his office, and in an invective-laden tirade said to him, I want this vaccine out before the election. Hahn, to his credit, in this instance, stood tall, because the way vaccine trials are done is that you have to have at least a 2-month follow-up after the last dose to test for safety, because when serious side effects can occur with any vaccine, invariably they occur within really 4 to 6 weeks of getting the vaccine. So you wanted that 2-month safety follow-up, which took you into December. And Hahn put it on his website. He wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, which at the time no one believed because of what had just happened with hydroxychloroquine. But he said, trust me, we are going to do this the right way. But imagine what would have happened. You have 10 states that form their own vaccine advisory committees because they didn't trust our committee, and I could understand why. Actually, Zeke Emanuel and I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times fearing an October surprise for that reason. So that was the first thing that I think caused people to fear whether politics was going to trump science, so to speak, in this vaccine. Okay, so that was the first hit. The second hit occurred in mid-2021, July 2021. When thousands of men got together to celebrate the July 4th holiday in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And about 79% or so were vaccinated. Nonetheless, there was an outbreak of COVID. And 346 of those men who had been vaccinated got COVID. 4 of the 346, or roughly 1.2%, were hospitalized. That's a vaccine working well. You have a hospitalization rate of 1.2%. That is a vaccine working extremely well, as was suggested by the data that were presented in December of 2020. The remaining 342 had mild or asymptomatic infections. When the CDC reported that outbreak, which they did in their journal of Morbidity and Mortality weekly report, the phrase that they used to describe those mild or asymptomatic infections was breakthrough infections. Wrong word. breakthrough implies failure. This wasn't a failure. The goal was to try and prevent this virus from causing severe disease. This is the goal of every vaccine: prevent severe disease, keep people out of the hospital, keep them out of the intensive care unit, keep them out of the morgue. By using the term breakthrough, in July of 2021, we created an unrealistic expectation for this vaccine. People thought, I got this vaccine. In fact, I was mandated to get this vaccine. And even though I got it the way I was supposed to get it, now I have, a mild or moderate illness. The CDC lied to me. They said I was going to be protected, and now I have this breakthrough infection. It was interesting. I was on CNN a fair amount during 2021, and there was a time when I was on, and I was, you sort of wait for about 10 minutes before you actually get on. But there was Brett Kavanaugh as part of a routine screening, right? Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, as part of a routine screening to go into the chamber, the Supreme Court chamber, was found to be positive. He was asymptomatically infected. If you watch the way that was carried on CNN, you would have thought the man was fighting for his life. They kept using the term breakthrough infection. I mean, it was hard to watch. Actually, Lindsey Graham had gotten his 2 doses of vaccine. He had a moderate infection characterized by mild sinusitis. And he said, this would have been much worse if I hadn't been vaccinated. Right, exactly right. Lindsey Graham got that right. Okay, so that was the second communications error. I think the third communications error are later. So now we're in August of 2021. President Biden stood up in front of the American public and said, as of the week of September 20th, so roughly 1 month in the future, he stood up on August 18th, we, the government, are going to offer a third dose, a booster dose, to everyone over 12 years of age, because at that time, the vaccine had been authorized for everyone over 12. In May, it was authorized for everyone over 12. So that's what he said. You can get we are going to offer a booster dose for everyone over 12 years of age. Now, the data at the time were that you still had excellent protection against severe disease is the goal. The goal is not to prevent mild disease. It's to prevent severe disease. And so that was a surprising announcement, for a couple of reasons. One, because it didn't comport with the data. The data still showed excellent protection against severe disease. There were about 6 studies that were published around July, August, showing protection against severe disease was holding up. And that really was true up until December of 2021, because Omicron, or the Omicron variants, hadn't entered the country yet. So 2 doses was still actually working well to protect against severe disease. And so we had an emergency meeting on September the 17th. The FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee had an emergency meeting on September 17th to address President Biden's statement. This was so upsetting to people that 2 senior officials at the FDA quit, Marion Gruber and Phil Krause, both of whom were senior officials on the vaccine side of the Centers for Biological Evaluation and Research, which is the part of FDA that's associated with vaccines. They quit. Man, these were longtime FDA officials, because they were so upset that President Biden had gone around gone around the FDA, gone around the CDC, and simply declared this is what we were going to do. So when we met on September the 20th, we looked at the data to answer the question, we need a third dose. And we uniformly said no. It went to the CDC Advisory Committee a couple weeks later, who also said no. So here you have the government saying everybody needs a third dose, and then you have 2 advisory committees, the FDA and CDC, saying no, which thoroughly confused people about protecting. And I think that remains today. The next problem I think that came up was really not. So I think those were the sort of 3 communications errors. I think hydroxychloroquine, the notion of breakthrough illnesses, and then this notion of everybody needing a third dose were unforced errors. Those were avoidable errors. Then I'm going to get to what I think was an unavoidable error, but was probably, it's a little in the, this is an error because it wasn't communicated as an error, although it was. So I'm going to tell you what that is, and then I'll probably largely be done with my rant, and you guys can ask your questions. But When Omicron entered the country in December of 2021, this was an immune evasive strain, especially for antibodies. It was immune evasive for antibodies. So now people who'd been vaccinated or been naturally infected were still susceptible to getting at least a mild or moderate illness. Still largely protected against severe disease, but still now susceptible to a mild or moderate illness. And so the thinking at the time, which made sense, was why are we still using this ancestral strain, the original strain, the Wuhan 1 strain? Why don't we put Omicron in the vaccine? Use a half a dose of the ancestral strain and a half a dose of this. At the time, it was going to be initially the original Omicron strain, BA1, but then it became BA4, it evolved to BA4, BA5. Let's do that. And so those data were presented to our committee then in June of 2022, and they were singularly unimpressive. The immunological data was not clear that the bivalent vaccine was any better than the monovalent vaccine that we had. So there were a couple no votes on that committee. Nonetheless, the next day, the government purchased 170, or the next day purchased 105 million doses of Pfizer's vaccine. A month later, they purchased another 56 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. Still no human studies. Because the original data we were presented was with BA1, not BA4, BA5. So there was still no human data. And then the CDC recommended it in September for universal use in all those who were at high risk. Still no human data. When the human data finally came out by the end of the year, it was clear that it wasn't any better immunologically. And then there were 3 clinical studies: one in the United States, one in the United Kingdom, and one in France, showing that this clinically was no better than the monovalent vaccine. It was worse. Boosters boosted. People who were at high risk definitely benefited from that vaccine, but it was no better because we made the mistake of 2 half doses. And also by giving it in the same vial to people who had already been inoculated a couple times with the ancestral strain, we suffered the sin of original antigenic sin, or imprinting. We couldn't recognize those novel epitopes on now this Omicron subvariant because full dose of the Omicron variant, which we learned. And so lesson learned, right? I mean, this is the part that I think is the hardest to communicate. You learn as you go. And this is what we learned. We shouldn't have done 2 half doses. What upset me in all this is no one ever said that. I mean, those who were in positions to say it, like Dr. Ashish Jha or Dr. Fauci or Vivek Murthy, or the head of the CDC, were all in a position to say something, but didn't. And because I think at this point, things were so divisive in this country. It was like you're on the bus or you're off the bus. And if you said something that in any way was critical of what had just happened, which was that the bivalent was no better, you thought that you would only further lose trust. Although my thinking on this is that you should just tell the truth. I mean, and let the chips fall where they may. I think what's interesting to me, and I mean, my history or background is not one of public health. I was 25 years working on rotaviruses, trying to create the strains that became a rotavirus vaccine, which means I was in a small windowless concrete block room in the Wistar Institute, inoculating mice, which is not exactly a public health background. But when you did your studies and you would present your studies at national or international meetings, you drew a conclusion. I think that these 2 proteins are critical for inducing protective immunity. So you draw a conclusion. And then what happens is you get criticized. You want to be criticized. You want people to say, I don't think you can draw that conclusion exactly that way because you didn't do this control or that control, or it wasn't robust, or it wasn't internally reproducible, whatever. That's how your science gets better. That's the scientific process, which is one of criticism. And then moving forward. That does not work well in a public health arena. I mean, I wrote an op-ed or perspective piece for the New England Journal of Medicine at the end of 2022 saying that I think that the bivalent vaccine was a mistake, and that we have to be careful about how we chase variants. And was, and it would have never been published in the New England Journal of Medicine unless people agreed. I mean, those who reviewed that prospective piece agreed. It was published at the same time that two studies, one out of Harvard, one out of Columbia, showed that it was no better, that the bivalent vaccine was no better. But, I got a lot of criticism from public health people because I had gone off the bus. And I think it was a painful lesson for me, actually, that that what works so well, at least in a scientific community, didn't work well in a public health setting. So I just think you ask people, do you think we're going to know more 100 years from now about science and medicine than we know now? I think everyone would say yes. But when it comes to your disease, or in this case, our pandemic, I think people want to believe that you know everything you need to know when you don't. Of course you don't. I mean, when we looked at the data in December of 2020 of say, Pfizer's vaccine, which was a 40,000 person placebo-controlled trial, meaning 20,000 people got a vaccine, or Moderna's, which was a 30,000 person placebo-controlled trial, meaning 15,000 people got a vaccine. That was 35,000 people that got a vaccine for a vaccine that was about to be given to hundreds of millions of people. You knew the other shoe was going to drop. It had to. You were about to find out what rare side effects were occurring that you couldn't possibly pick up in 35,000 people, but you could certainly pick up when it's given to tens of millions of people, which is what happened. You had myocarditis as an occurrence that occurred within a few days of the second dose of the mRNA vaccines, primarily in boys and men, young men. And then you had J&J's vaccine, the adenovirus vector vaccine, which was found to cause clotting, including clotting in the brain, including fatal clotting in the brain, which ultimately drove that vaccine off the market in May of last year. And people see that and they say, see, you can't trust these people. But that's exactly why you can trust us, in part, because there are systems in place to pick that up. But you knew it was going to happen. I mean, there's not a medical innovation in the history of this world that has not been associated with some human price. I mean, there is a human price for the acquisition of scientific knowledge. And it's very hard to explain that to people. It is. And I think, one way to look at this is to know that the virus, SARS-CoV-2, also causes myocarditis more commonly and more severely. Clotting, including fatal clotting. So again, more commonly and more severely. But I think we have a difficult time understanding risk, or said another way, that we rate risk differently. That greater risk associated with getting naturally infected, different than a risk associated with getting a vaccine, because you choose to get a vaccine or choose to vaccinate your child. So that's my rant. I'm pretty much done. Hopefully I didn't break up. Sitting here in my office, talking to myself, but I assume people heard me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, we heard you, but there were times when it was something fits and starts. We're those of you listening on and watching on YouTube, please do put your questions on in the comment section of YouTube, and we will try to answer as many as we can. You brought up a really interesting point that I'd never thought of before. Well, of course, there are a lot of things I never thought of before, but it's really very basic, but I hadn't realized it, and probably a lot of other people didn't either. And that is the real difference between medical research, which follows the paradigm of scientific discovery that we're all used to, iterative criticism, basically, rinse and repeat. And gradually you sort of stumble closer to a solution to whatever problem it is you're working on. But that back and forth, no, I was wrong about this, but I'm right about this. And no, actually I wasn't wrong about that. And here's why, that kind of thing, which we are used to as scientists, it just kind of, that's how we think. And I'd never really thought about how different that is from a public health standpoint. Not that people who do public health research aren't also scientists. That wasn't my point. But I think what you were saying, if I understood you, is that the public, when it looks at pronouncements like those that came out during COVID from the scientific community, from the advisory panels and the contradictions between them and the political people and so forth. It tends to just reinforce that misconception about science, that science is, it's the Rumpelstiltskin principle, name it and nail it. Once we solve this problem, then we never have to worry about it again. But that's not the way nature works, and that's not the way science works, because something can come up and show that this explanation needs to be tweaked somehow. But it is true, I think. I think you absolutely were correct that the public does have very different expectations about how science works and how we as members of the public can use the discoveries of science. And I think that misunderstanding is really very basic to a lot of the problems that you skipped through in what you called your rant. That probably wasn't the most clear explanation, but do you understand what I'm talking about? Ish.
Mm-hmm.
No, yeah. Go ahead. The breaking up that we're having with Dr. Offutt's connection is going to be exacerbated a little bit with my talking as well. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to both talk at the same time. Another issue that came to me as I was listening to you is that there seems to be a prevalent feeling in the public that, not prevalent, but a strong feeling in the public that we really can't trust the pronouncements made by, shall we say, government scientists particularly. And I think you've iterated some of the reasons for this, the unforced errors, as well as the sort of not forced, but unfortunately it came across as an error. We're in an election year. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how some of those apprehensions might be playing out in the next several months. Not that, Bay Area Skeptics supports or denigrates candidates. That's not the point. But in a general way, there are candidates that are both for national as well as state and local who are promoting anti-vaccination views. And to what extent can we deal with these in a way that would help the public understand the value of these?
Okay, so here's what I would say. There really has never been a politics to the anti-vaccine movement until now. There's always, because vaccines require resources, and resources are public resources, there's always at some level politics involved in support of vaccines, but it's never really been partisan. On the left, it was all things natural, don't inject me with anything that has a chemical name. I want to just live a natural, gluten-free, bisphenol A-free, dolphin-free life. That's the left. And so, for example, the 2014-2015 measles outbreak in Southern California started in a very heavily Democratic area and then spread to 25 states.
I'm afraid
that was
I
the
have
phenomenon
to.
On the left. On the right, it's what you see now. Yeah.
I'm afraid, yeah, off and on. I do want to come back to this left-right, because I think that's a misconception, but please finish your thought.
Okay, so on the right, it's what you see now, this sort of libertarian government off my back, don't tell me what to do, don't mandate vaccines. And I think that's what happened here. I think we, by mandating vaccines, by mandating it so that you couldn't go to school, or you couldn't go to work, or you couldn't go to your place of worship, or you can go to a sport event. It really upset people, and I think that became much more a phenomenon of the right. It did. You were much more likely to be hospitalized and much more likely to die if you lived in a heavily red county than a heavily blue county. Hence the name Red COVID. Eric Trump at one point said at a rally, know that if you don't want to get a vaccine, the Republican Party has your back. Donald Trump has also, if anything, distances himself from vaccines, which is remarkable considering that Operation Warp Speed was amazing. It was under his administration. It was an $11 billion program. It basically bet on just to win one race. And a few of them won the race, and it would have never happened without that program. That was an amazing program. I think it really, if you had to pick for me, the greatest accomplishment in the Trump administration, that was it. Yet he distances himself from that. I don't know. I like Jimmy Kimmel's explanation for that. He said that he thinks that the reason Trump distanced himself from that achievement is that at his heart he's a very modest man who doesn't like to put his name on things. But that might be wrong.
Oh, that must be it. That must be it. Well, he simultaneously wants
I don't know. I mean, I think
credit for it. I say he simultaneously wants to take credit for Operation Warp Speed.
Well, you saw recently.
At the same time, he listens to his base, which has been much more influenced by those kind of more libertarian, don't tell me what to do kind of views. And, I'm your leader. Where are you taking me? Is sort of, the push me, pull you on that.
Well, also the run up to the 2016 election, he said, beautiful child gets a vaccine and then has autism. So he made that link. He's said that he thinks Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is brilliant and a smart man and knows what he's talking about. So he's perfectly willing to align himself with the anti-vaccine folks. And then more recently, he said that he would not support states or school districts or whatever that had a vaccine mandate. And it was unclear whether he was talking about all school vaccine mandates or just COVID mandates. It was unclear. But so he has not been a fan of vaccines. He wasn't nearly the anti-vaccine activist I feared, actually, when he was elected in 2016. But I don't consider him a friend of vaccines.
I don't think we can consider. I don't think we can consider him an ally, to say the least. I just want to get back to a niggling point before we take questions from the YouTube listeners. And by the way, put your questions in the comments section, please, YouTube listeners. You mentioned that both the left and the right have their anti-vaccine kinds of positions. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. I think you're dead on in terms of your characterization of why conservatives don't like vaccines. I think that's, it's not a discussion, really. It's true. The thing about the anti-vax movement is that it is so much more nuanced and complex than many of the other, anti-science views that we have. I mean, I spent a good deal of my working career working on the creationists, and they were simple compared to the anti-vaxxers, and they were not simple. But the purity argument, don't put anything in my body that is not, that has chemicals in it, as you put it, and something that I don't understand, et cetera. That is not so much a left view as it is a New Age view. And New Age is left and right and something in between and apolitical and everything else. Where you get a lot of New Agers, like in Marin County about 7-8 years ago, where you had a big blip in, or I should say a lower blip. Anyway, where vaccination plummeted in a couple of pockets, not all over the county, but in a couple of pockets. Those happened to be places where you really had a lot of New Agey kind of enthusiasms rather than, the overall liberalism that you associate with this Northern California county. Where I think you can get, so we say leftist anti-vax positions is more, I think, along the socioeconomic front, where it's big pharma out to get us, which is not the same thing as purity. So, like I say, there's so many different levels and components to the anti-vax movement. It's fascinating in that regard. But I don't think it can be very neatly categorized as an anti-science movement at all, which is not what you were saying, certainly. And as part of that, I don't think it can be neatly categorized as the left-right kind or left-right pox on both your houses. I think the pox has to be a lot heavier in one of the houses, but I digress. Anyway, that was just a minor point. I think your major point is very well taken. May we have a question from the YouTube visitors?
No, it's a good point. Thank you.
If we didn't need a third shot, do we need the annual top-ups that are being offered now?
Okay, so thank you for asking that question. I think that the critical issue is who's being hospitalized and who's dying from this virus, because that's what you're trying to prevent. So according to the CDC's data, and the data that let me take a step back. Once Omicron came into the country, initially the BA1 strain, and then the subsequent, BA4, BA5, JN1, et cetera, XBB.1.5, all the subsequent Omicron variants. These are more immune-evasive strains. And so then the question became, do you benefit from a third dose, or do you benefit from a fourth dose? And the answer was yes, but not everybody equally benefited. If you look at who benefited, it really fell into several groups. One are people who were with Rochelle Walensky, whose name I couldn't think of earlier for whatever reason, the CDC director at the time. Rochelle Walensky defined, thank goodness, as the elderly, which meant people over 75. Those were the US data. The UK data were actually people over 80. In other words, if you just look at age alone and don't look at age plus comorbidities, it was elderly. It was people who have comorbidities, meaning healthcare issues that put them at high risk of hospitalization, like chronic lung disease, chronic heart disease, diabetes, obesity. Those are the big ones. Next are anybody who's immune compromised, either because they are getting immune suppressive therapy for their autoimmune diseases, immune suppressive therapy for their cancers or status post transplants. And then lastly, pregnant people. So those are the groups. And so if you look at other countries, with the exception of Canada, every other country recommends that you get a dose of vaccine in a manner similar to the flu vaccine for those high-risk groups. We didn't do that. We said everybody over 6 months of age should get a dose. And I talked actually with Dr. Fauci about this because I wanted to know if I was reading the data wrong, because to me, the data show that here's who's dying and here's who's getting hospitalized. So shouldn't we target those groups? And his feeling, and I think it's the feeling of public health, is that the best way to get those groups vaccinated is to recommend it for everybody. And I think it's a testable hypothesis. My personal belief is I think it's okay to have a nuanced message. The goal is to keep people out of the hospital, out of the ICU, out of the morgue. Yeah. Who's dying from this vaccine, from this virus? Who's getting admitted to the hospital from this virus? It really falls into those high-risk groups.
Here in Northern California, where we have the Kaiser Foundation is a very large entity, and they also do good research, but there's that. My husband and I just went to he had to have a checkup. And they said, since you're old people, you and I I'm a little bit older than you are, but you and I are a similar cohort that remembers polio. You are eligible for the booster shot. Would you like it now? So yes, older people, immunocompromised people, pregnant women, etc. There are categories, as you were saying, amongst the breaking up that specifically you want to target first. And I'm interested in your view about I forget exactly who it was. One of the other nations or somebody was saying, no, I'm sorry, that was here in the US, that maybe you should come back. We'll see what happens. Yay. You were mentioning that in the United States, the feeling is, well, just tell everybody to get it, and then you'll get the high-risk groups as well. And you were saying when you started breaking up that a more nuanced approach certainly seems quite reasonable. It is testable, hasn't been tested yet. But maybe in some of these other countries, there may be some more data on that. But yeah, public health, it's very different from, the kinds of things we're talking about here. Okay.
Well, we do have nuanced messages for other vaccines. It's not, it's not only this vaccine. Yeah.
Yeah. That's true. Is there another question from the YouTube watchers? Dr. Laurie says, I had incorrectly thought that the amazing vaccine for COVID would solve vaccine hesitancy in general. Is there evidence that parents are more or less likely to vaccinate their kids post-pandemic? Interesting question.
First of all, I could not agree more. If you asked me at the beginning of this pandemic, how did I think vaccines would be viewed? I thought they would be viewed as I saw them, which was a lifesaver. Yeah. Finally, you had a ticket out of this pandemic. Think of 2020. What did we have? We had nothing. We didn't have antivirals till October of 2020. We didn't have monoclonals till November of 2020. We didn't have vaccines till December of 2020. All we had was limit human-to-human contact. It was a nightmare. The streets were barren. I mean, you were restricted to home, and then you had vaccines. I mean, I practically cried when I got my first dose of vaccine. And I would argue I'm an informed person about vaccines. I mean, I saw 300 pages of data on the Pfizer vaccine that was submitted to us before we recommended authorization, and 300 pages of data on the Moderna vaccine. I think I saw the data on those vaccines and couldn't wait to get vaccinated. And I assumed everybody else would feel the same way, because often the anti-vaccine activists will say, stop talking to me about polio. Stop talking to me about diphtheria. Give me a pandemic and I'll get vaccinated. Okay, this was the pandemic. Yes. But I think by mandating vaccines, and in some ways, I think you could argue we went a little too far from mandates. I know my son-in-law, who was at Cornell Business School, healthy, a mid-20-year-old guy at the time, was mandated to get a fourth dose to get back on campus. That didn't make any sense to me. But in any case, I think what we did was we created this backlash. And so in November of last year, the CDC published data showing that at a level not seen recently, parents of kindergartners are choosing non-medical exemptions, philosophical exemptions, religious exemptions. Yeah. And so the immunization rate is starting to drop, 2%. And so you see measles outbreaks, which is exactly what you would expect when you see immunization rates start to drop, because measles is the canary in the coal mine. It's the most contagious of the vaccine preventable diseases. The good news about measles, not that there ever is good news about any infectious disease, but I think that Philadelphia in 1991, and that 3-month period of winter, sort of 1991, 1992, where we had 1,400 cases and 9 deaths. I mean, it was a nightmare. We were vaccinated down to 6 months of age. We, had hundreds of thousands of dollars given to us by the state to vaccinate. People were scared to come into the city. What's epidemic? I quizzed our pediatric residents about this, and they never get it right. But what stopped that epidemic was spring. But you move into late spring, stop circulating. I think that's what's going to save us, and then we'll see what happens next.
Yeah. You had mentioned, and I had seconded it, that we're of the age that we do remember polio before the polio vaccine. And I was about 10 or so before the polio vaccine came along and was available. And I remember very well the little boy next door who was exactly my age. We would play, until he got polio and ended up paralyzed from the neck down in a wheelchair the rest of his life, and he died early. Just recently, there was a news article about a man who had spent something like 60 years in an iron lung. He had managed to phenomenal. What a strong and admirable individual. But how many times do people think about iron lungs these days? You and I know an iron lung is this large, clunky machine that changes the pressure so that it breathes for you, because in many cases of polio, children lost the ability to breathe by themselves. And of course, if you can't breathe, you die. And so iron lungs kept children alive. And then finally the vaccine came, and we lined up in droves to get it because everybody knew how scary polio was. And, you know, unlike um, the big pox, smallpox, polio is not eradicated. Close, you know, very close. But there's still some pockets in other countries, and there's no reason why it couldn't come back if we don't get the, you know, herd immunity that we need from vaccination. And of course, nobody's been vaccinating for polio for a long time because we have had herd immunity. So yeah, it's a scary situation with the reduced enthusiasm for vaccination. I think people don't understand how really awful measles can be, and the health
you know, on
effects.
polio, I mean, if I can just, there was a case of polio in a 27-year-old in Rockland County in 2022.
Yeah.
He never left the country, and what he was infected with was a revert strain, meaning the oral polio vaccine could revert to essentially neurovirulent type virus, so similar to wild type virus, so that you could actually get polio from the oral polio vaccine. Well, that strain is around. That revertant strain is around, and when you're infected with that strain, about 1 in 2,000 people who are infected will be paralyzed. So when you see him being paralyzed, you can assume he's the tip of a much bigger iceberg. And when you did wastewater analysis, not only in his county, Rockland County, but the surrounding counties, that virus is there. And I bet if you looked in Philadelphia, or you looked in San Francisco, or you looked in LA or Chicago, you would find that virus. Drop immunization far enough, and that's what happened in Rockland County. Immunization rates in his particular zip code was 30%. And so that was far enough to see polio come back. Stop, you know, that's not a disease you want to relive. I'm with you. I was in a polio ward when I was 5 years old. I didn't have polio. I had a botched operation on my right foot. But I remember kids in iron lungs. I remember the Sister Kenny hot pack treatments. It was a nightmare. It was Dickensian. It was awful. You want to relive these.
Yeah, no, we don't want that. Can I have another YouTube question, please? Molasses says, what can the recent hyper-vaccinated individual teach us? He intentionally received over 200 vaccines, presumably with no side effects and normal immunity. I'm afraid I haven't heard of this chap. Have you?
Yeah.
Okay, so please enlighten us.
I think it was in Germany, but he had received 217 doses of vaccine. The sense was that he was going to take, every time he got a vaccine card, he would then sell it so people could say they'd been vaccinated. So they studied it. Now, and that paper was published, but I don't think you can make a lot out of one person's case. But he did have a very broad T cell response. So I'm not sure the lesson is get 217 doses of vaccine, but he was an interesting story. I guess I don't make a lot out of it because it was just one person. We're an outbred population, so it's hard to know.
Yeah, I think we want to discourage people from science by anecdote. We have too much of that already. Another YouTube question, please. There's Steve Julio says, there's no convincing an anti-vaxxer is only true as far as the level of distrust is high. What can we do to bridge that divide, establish a level of trust to undergird meaningful conversations? That's a tough question.
I think that if someone is a dedicated anti-vaccine activist, meaning they believe there's a conspiracy to sell vaccines, they believe anybody in the healthcare profession that's talking to them is part of that conspiracy, I don't think you're going to have much success. But I think where you can have success is and I talk about this in the book. If you look at the people who weren't getting vaccinated, it's a general rule they didn't have much contact with the healthcare community. They didn't have a doctor. I was on a show the other day with a guy named Glenn Ellis, an African American man, and he said when at the beginning of the pandemic they said, "Don't go to the hospital if you're sick. Don't go to the emergency department because those both were overwhelmed. Call your doctor." He said, "You weren't talking about my community. My community didn't have a doctor." So to me, I think in terms of bridging that divide, I think someone like Ayla Stanford is a hero to me. Ayla Stanford is a Black surgeon at Temple University who took it upon herself to form something called the Black Doctors COVID Consortium, which many people, dozens of people, who then went to North Philadelphia, sat in people's living rooms, explained that what this vaccine couldn't do. And then if they didn't want to get the vaccine, she would go back again. And again, ultimately, she got 50,000 people in North Philadelphia to get vaccinated. North Philadelphia is primarily a Black and brown community. To me, she was a ray of light, one of the many ray of lights in this pandemic. And though we need 1,000 Ayla Stanford, people who look like you, who you trust, whose opinion you trust, who then can convince, has a chance of convincing.
You know, that is right on target with what communications research tells us. And that is that you can change people's minds. So Steve, there's hope here. You can change people's minds, although you don't do it in one pass. It requires simple messages from a trusted messenger, hence your doctor, repeated often. And of those three characteristics, the trusted messenger is the most important. It's really, I was mentioning this to a neighbor of mine, and she was saying, oh, but this anti-vaccine stuff, people get their advice from their Facebook parents group. I said, well, that could be a trusted messenger. I mean, a trusted messenger isn't necessarily a physician, isn't necessarily somebody who is scientifically knowledgeable about it. It could just be it's somebody that you trust, and you got really good advice from your Facebook parents group about how to handle your kids' colic. So, that becomes a trusted source. So it's important to get on. It's important for those of us and people listening who know something about a subject to try to get out the word as often as possible in as many places as possible, because all you need to do is kind of crack that door a little bit, and then maybe the next time the person hears it, the door is going to get cracked a little bit more, and it's definitely worthwhile. I don't think it's worthwhile just throwing up your hands and saying we'll never be able to do anything, we just have to wait for these people to die. Not a good approach and not very helpful. All right, can we have another YouTube question, please? Jay Diamond asks, in some cultures, patients expect a remedy when visiting a doctor. Do you think that there is any value in giving the third shot to calm public fear? So this sounds
I
like,
think that you should.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think that, well, I don't think so. I think that you should inject someone with a biological if it is clearly a benefit to them. I mean, what an additional dose will do is it will give you better protection against mild disease for the next 4 to 6 months. That's what it does. So it's pretty much low risk, low reward. For the most part, if you are a healthy young person, and I'm now defining young as less than 75, but if you're a healthy young person and you've had either 3 doses of vaccine or 2 doses of vaccine in a natural infection, you probably have a high frequency of memory B and T cells, which will protect you against severe disease. I mean, you're going to get mild disease, just as it's true for any short incubation period mucosal infection like influenza, respiratory syncytial virus. You're going to get mild disease again and again. We have to get used to that. And I think part of the fear here is long COVID. And what I would say about long COVID is that there was a great study out of Italy that I think looked at this. So the question to be answered was, does vaccination increase your risk of long COVID? And long COVID is more than one thing, and it's defined variably. But at least in this study, what they found is if you were unvaccinated and you got COVID, your incidence of long COVID was 42%. If you got 1 dose of vaccine and got COVID, your incidence of long COVID went from 42% to 30%. If you got 2 doses of vaccine and had COVID, you went from 30% to 17%. If you got 3 doses of vaccine and then got COVID, you went from 17% to 16%. So there didn't seem to be an advantage to the third dose. Other studies have shown some advantage to the third dose, but I think beyond that, I don't think you're making any difference.
For long COVID.
Right. I've gotten 3 doses of vaccine infection, and until it's clear to me that I need an additional dose, that people like me, generally healthy less than 75-year-olds, are getting hospitalized. I'm not going to get another vaccine yet. I mean, I think I have high frequencies of memory B and T cells, which protect me against severe disease. It's not protecting me against mild disease. I mean, my infection, my natural infection occurred 6 months after my third dose, which is just about when you would expect it to happen because the antibodies that I had in my circulation had declined. So once again, I'm susceptible to mild disease.
Indeed. Can we have the last question, please? From Pillow Knot. Bought the last book. Would like to know more about the new one. Let me give a very brief comment about this. This one, tell me when it's over. This is an exceedingly well-organized book. I was, like I say, I've just started reading and I haven't been through, but the major sections are where we were, where we are, and where we're heading. And I think that's a great way to organize a book like this. And it's very easy to read, and it's very, very comfortable. Okay, that's my pitch. I think this is great. I'm looking forward to finishing it. You tell us more about it.
Yeah, I think it was cathartic for me to write. I mean, I was, by being on, the NIH committee and being on the FDA's committee, and having, very close association with people in the CDC's advisory committee, I think I have behind the scenes here. And so it was cathartic for me to write the things I think we got right, very right, and the things that we didn't get right and I think we can do better. And so at the end of the book, I talk about sort of the 10 or so that I think we can do better for next time. But I needed to write this book just because it was very, this was a rough 4 years for all of us, me included, and just, and I have so much respect for the people that worked at the people that worked at the CDC. I just think there was a politics that trumped science a little bit, and that was upsetting for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, you will be able to read about that and much more in this book, so I would recommend it. Paul, I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. It was a pleasure having you as usual. You were enlightening, and I just can't thank you enough for. I know you're very busy, not just with Meet the Press, but a lot of claims on your time. So thanks for spending time with Bay Area Skeptics.
Well, thank you, Gene. It's my pleasure.
You're welcome.
Sounds good.
Now, the rest of you folks, be sure to join us for next month's Skep Talk, which will be at the usual time of 7:30 on April 11th, where we will have Professor Dave Farina, talking about science communication, about which he's thought a lot. So I think you'll enjoy it very much. Thank you for joining us. Thanks again to Paul Offit, and I hope to see you next month as well. Goodbye.